Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
I'm Christa Carmen.
And this is
Murder Coaster.
It's Vampire October, and this week's blood-sucking ghoul is one of the most terrifying killers you have ever heard of. A highly intelligent, sexually motivated monster with the genius-level IQ of 168, who used syringes and surgical tubing to drain his victims of their blood, and used stealth and cunning to deceive law enforcement for decades before his shocking and scandalous downfall. Strap in, for today we tell you the tale of the horrible and dreaded vampire rapist, John Brenan Crutchley.
Let's begin. Prologue. The Vampire's Release. On August 8th, 1996, FBI agent Robert Ressler was truly stunned. They were letting a serial killer go free in Florida. The vampire rapist, John Crutchley. To be clear, John Crutchley hadn't actually been convicted of murder, only kidnapping, torture, and sexual assault, having abducted a 19-year-old girl and drained her of nearly 40% of her blood. But he was a suspect in over 30 unsolved murders, and everywhere John Crutchley went, bodies began appearing. And FBI agent Robert Ressler was positive he was a serial killer.
Robert Ressler was a famed FBI agent. He'd headed the behavioral science unit and actually coined the term serial killer, a subject he was an expert in, having interviewed Ted Bundy, David Berkowitz, John Wayne Gacy, Edmund Kemper, last week's vampire Richard Chase, as well as today's subject, John Crutchley, the vampire rapist.
Robert Ressler had worked with law enforcement in Florida during the investigation and prosecution of John Crutchley, had even testified at his sentencing, telling the court that in his professional opinion, Crutchley was an organized sexual offender who matched the serial killer profile, and that he planned his offenses, typically targeted strangers, controlled and manipulated his victims to get them to vulnerable positions, remained in control throughout his offenses, demanded submissive victims, and used restraints such as handcuffs and shackles, concealed his victims' bodies, and hid weapons and evidence.
Furthermore, Ressler had testified that John Crutchley fit in the sexual psychopath category by exhibiting characteristics of someone lacking capacity for human empathy. The biological circuits of his brain had failed to form the neural connection necessary to experience empathy. Due to the defensive emotional detachment of his childhood, he learned to fake sadness, compassion, and empathy. Basically learned how to fake being a human being.
Explaining that a psychopath is basically a person with an incomplete personality, Ressler believed Crutchley to be an individual controlled by an indescribable emptiness that consumed his thoughts, directed his behavior, and dictated his action. The only sense of fulfillment was wielding absolute control over the life of another human being. But the comforting sensation was always transitory. The emptiness always returned, putting him in the lowest category for rehabilitation.
Robert Ressler, the world's most foremost expert on serial killers, was sure that if released, John Crutchley would kill again. It was only a matter of time.
But released he was, and much of the world waited with bated breath, wondering, would the vampire rapist strike again? While others, seeing the media barrage that erupted at his release, wondered who was this monster they called the vampire rapist.
Chapter 1. Little JB.
John Brenan Crutchley, or JB as he preferred to be known, was born October 1st, 1946, to upper-class parents in Clarksburg, West Virginia. JB's father had been born in England, but had immigrated to the United States as a child and went on to become the vice president of Consolidated Gas. His mother, Mildred, was a homemaker, born and raised there in Clarksburg, the same birthplace as Civil War Confederate General Stonewall Jackson.
JB had been a twin, but his identical brother was stillborn, just like Elvis. The year before JB had been born, his sister Donna June, 14 years old, had died under bizarre and mysterious circumstances before undergoing surgery to remove a glass tube from her bladder.
Donna June's cause of death was listed as, quote, nervous collapse, which occurred right before she was given the anesthetic. It's said that she was evidently deeply frightened and in a state of hysteria at the time.
The whole thing is really weird as hell. Just how does one get a glass tube in their bladder? JB would eventually come to believe she had been masturbating with it. The incident was very hush-hush, some kind of dark family secret. As JB would later say, "Mom really bared her soul when she told me the details of Donna's demise, and she asked that we never talk about it."
No one outside the family would ever really know what had happened, but her death devastated John's mother, who, in a desperate attempt to replace her dead daughter, raised JB as a girl for the first 5 years of his life.
From the moment JB was born, Mildred would whisper to him that she wished he was a girl, that he should have been a girl. Dressing him as a girl, even at the young age of 5, JB says he felt humiliated, angry, alienated, and alone because of this treatment.
William never made any attempts to bond with little JB and avoided any physical signs of affection, which may have been cultural, part of that old, stiff and stodgy English gentleman persona, but it left JB feeling unimportant and ignored.
It was a particularly strict household as well. One family friend described it as a type of, quote, harsh love, very stern.
Eventually, his mother went on to have another daughter, and after that, mostly ignored JB, which he said caused permanent feelings of inadequacy and unworthiness of love.
And it seems that when she wasn't ignoring him, she was abusing him, burning his fingers with a curling iron and beating him unconscious with a belt.
JB would claim that he desperately wanted parental affection, yet only received coldness, emotional isolation, and violence. So he sealed himself into a psychological cocoon to insulate himself.
East of the river, in the Garden of Eden, Eve is asleep with the lions this evening. Adam is staring into the atmosphere at planets and stars. The sky shone so clear. The riverside of
JB's father, William, had been raised in the Church of England, and in Virginia, the Crutchleys were very active in the Episcopalian Church, dragging JB to Mass every Sunday. But JB saw their devotion to church as completely hypocritical. In particular, the piety of his mother, how she acted so holy and meek in church, but at home would think nothing of beating him into unconsciousness with a belt.
When JB was 10, the family moved to a suburb outside of Pittsburgh, and this is when JB's fascination with electronics began. By the time he was in the 6th grade, he'd been dubbed an electronics wizard and would repair neighbors' televisions and stereos after school.
John became what the neighbors would call, quote, a weird, nerdy kid obsessed with gadgets, once even electrifying the doorknob of his bedroom to keep his mother out.
He was an odd child who often acted out and was considered a disciplinary problem. As JB himself would say,
Sometime around elementary school, I discovered being obnoxious was an effective way of covering up my lack of social skills.
because of this, he was often beaten, which appears to have fostered a streak of sadism.
Yeah, Albert Fish says he began developing his sexual fetishes after being beaten by nuns as a child.
And during the 50s and 60s, it was quite common for unruly children to be paddled by school administrators, a practice which is surprisingly still in use in some parts of the country.
Yeah, I got a buddy from Alabama, and he told me that they used to paddle him at school, that the principal would beat him with a paddle. And this was in a public school in like the 2000s. And I didn't even believe him at first, but then I Googled it and went down this rabbit hole, and it's totally true. He said he had to have a note signed by your parents to not get beaten.
Jesus.
Isn't that crazy?
That's wild. JB was an incredibly bright child, but was hyperactive, and while getting A's in physics and math, he failed most other courses and had to take remedial Spanish 3 times.
No bueno. Necesita estudiar más. His parents did everything they could to get him to study, but nothing worked. They sent him to a prep school, the Christ Church Episcopal Boys School, but he was again a disciplinary problem and failed out. They sent him to a psychiatrist who told his parents, I don't know who's interviewing who, if he's interviewing me or I'm interviewing him.
He had an IQ of 168, putting him on the same level as Einstein and Stephen Hawking. Yet he graduated at the bottom of his class, 173rd out of 193 students. And despite coming of age in an era of sexual liberation and free love, he stayed a virgin until he was 21 years old, stating,
I had no social skills and was scared of the opposite sex like crazy.
Instead of pursuing girls and dating, he preferred fantasizing about sexually controlling girls through violence and aggressive acts, living in a dark fantasy world.
He began taking classes at Defiance College, cool name, in Defiance, Ohio. It was the only school that would take him.
He was petty and cruel in college. Those who crossed him would find their cars vandalized. Campus police suspected him of many thefts, and JB was voted most likely to self-destruct by his classmates.
Fuck, man. He also began experimenting with bisexuality, something that would continue for the rest of his life, and that he claims was caused by his mother forcing him to dress as a girl and repeatedly saying that she'd wished he'd been born a girl.
He struggled through college, failing classes regularly, and was put on academic suspension when his GPA fell to a 1.4.
In September of 1967, JB transferred to Point Park College in Pittsburgh in another effort to improve his grades. And it was there that he met Maud Moats. Maud Moats was a petite, brown-haired, blue-eyed girl, and he got his grades up enough to return to Defiance College.
In 1968, JB found work as an engineer at the WONW radio station, and at 22 married Maud Moats. He'd later say he didn't love her, that he just needed someone to fulfill his sexual needs. He described her to people as a sex maniac. It's doubtful JB ever loved anyone.
The two moved into a trailer at a mobile home park in Defiance. Having always loved gadgets, he showed an uncanny ability with electronic equipment at the local radio station and threw himself into his work. But he was, as always, awkward and temperamental, argumentative, once throwing a heavy glass bottle at a fellow employee, and was fired after installing surveillance equipment to spy on the other employees.
Despite his terrible grades, JB eventually received his Bachelor of Science degree in physics from Defiance College, graduating 249th out of 261.
Chapter 2, The Real World. According to JB, returning to his parents' home to celebrate his college graduation, he and his little sister Carolyn had sex on their parents' sofa. JB claimed this incestuous sexual relationship would secretly last years. Yeah,
it's beyond disturbing. And according to his new wife, Maud, JB's sexual demands and violence in the bedroom quickly grew too much for her. And in 1973, she divorced him, and he moved to Indiana to work at GM's Delco Electronics division.
Maud would later say her husband was a crazy kleptomaniac who constantly shoplifted and stole for no reason other than the thrill of it. She also stated he could be explosively violent, erupting in rage and smashing things, throwing computers across the room, and was filled with bizarre sexual impulses, obsessed with wife swapping and group sex, saying he was, quote,
crazy and capable of most anything.
She claims he'd often choke her unconscious during sex, seeming to enjoy the strangulation more than the sex itself, and beat her so often she feared that if she did not leave him, he might kill her.
In 1972, JB was at a party at a local radio station and was introduced to Lisa Baker, a pretty petite blonde. The two shared a love of the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, and both were liberal Democrats who loved to talk about politics.
JB swept Lisa off her feet, taking her on vacation with him to Jamaica, and within 10 months, they were living together, and they lived the life of 70s swingers, swapping partners and finding other couples through the classified section of sex magazines, JB often indulging in his bisexual desires.
Apparently, other swingers were often eager to include JB in their romps because he was, quote, hung like a donkey.
In 1977, JB quit his job at Delco after being accused of stealing $4,000 worth of light-emitting diodes. His boss later described him as smart, but incredibly immature and insecure, seeking vengeance on anyone whom he thought slighted him in any way.
So JB and Lisa moved to Fairfax, Virginia, where JB took a job with Logicon Inc., but just 3 months later was fired for having put false information on his application, namely his former salary at Delco, as well as the reason he left.
Then something happened with Lisa, for she suddenly left him, and JB moved to Rockville, Maryland, working at information and communications applications and pursuing a master's degree at George Washington University.
JB underwent a physical transformation at this point.
He'd always been the epitome of the 1950s nerd, a total Poindexter, frail and thin with thick glasses and this terrible haircut. But during this time, he gained a little weight, put on some muscle, got contact lenses, started wearing his hair in a longer, hipper look, and began lightening it to a blonde color. And the difference when you compare the images is actually remarkable.
JB was now a full-on player.
But JB displayed a disturbing obsession with women he was attracted to and wanted absolute control over any woman he dated. He began keeping an index card file system on women, meticulously recording personal information about them and rating their sexual performance.
Chapter 3. Debbie.
While working and going to school, JB moved into a trailer in Fairfax, Virginia, and started dating a girl named Debbie Fritzschawn.
Debbie had grown up in the Virginia suburbs surrounding Washington, D.C. She was petite and blonde with hazel eyes and dreamed of one day being a writer.
She also attended George Washington University, where she studied business administration. She and John met in the cafeteria, and she was instantly captivated by the articulate and well-dressed JB.
Debbie introduced JB to her family, who were also charmed by the intelligent young man. But apparently, at some point, Debbie saw a side of JB she didn't like. For one night, when her grandmother asked her about him, she said they were through and that he was a, quote, nutball.
But on Friday night, January 27th, 1978, Debbie agreed to see him again, telling her grandmother she was headed to his place for dinner. She was never seen alive again.
A missing persons report was filed, but since Debbie was an adult, and since there were no signs of foul play, there wasn't much the police could do. If Debbie had chosen to run off, as many young people did, they had to respect her privacy.
Her car was then found in the parking lot of Hunter's Lodge, a country music nightclub about a mile from JB's trailer. No one in the club had any idea how the car had gotten there, and no one remembered seeing her that night.
JB, meanwhile, had left town early the next morning, going on an impromptu vacation. When Debbie's family eventually contacted him, he claimed she had come by that evening, but left around 11.
When her mother's birthday came and went without a word from Debbie, her family became very alarmed and hired a private investigator.
When contacted by the private investigator, JB was friendly and calm and claimed the two were just friends and had never engaged in sexual activity.
It had now been 3 weeks since her mysterious disappearance, and now, facing more and more pressure from Debbie's family, the police were starting to really investigate, questioning JB, even following him about, putting the pressure on him. Eventually, JB agreed to a lie detector test.
During the first lie detector test, JB grew angry and refused to answer any more questions and stormed off. He then agreed to a second test, which he failed miserably. Just off the charts, blatantly refusing to even say whether he and Debbie had ever had sexual relations. The test also suggested, quote, deep-seated psychological problems.
Investigators began interviewing JB's former girlfriends and his ex-wife, and a very disturbing portrait of a violent sexual sadist emerged. Nearly all his former partners saying he choked them into unconsciousness during sex at one point or another, and that he kept ropes attached to the corner of his bed and enjoyed wearing a mask during sex. Which, I don't know, there's something really creepy about wanting to wear a mask during sex to me.
Yeah, like multiple levels there, on multiple levels.
I mean, if it's your thing, whatever, it's fine, but it just, I don't know. It seems creepy.
Yeah. Meanwhile, JB got engaged to a woman named Kathy Mosley, and she moved into his trailer.
And then, bodies began to turn up. In nearby North Carolina, in an area where JB was known to often frequent, the badly decomposed body of a white female, 15 to 18 years old, 110 pounds, was found not far from where JB's ex, Lisa Baker, lived. Then the body of a 14-year-old girl was found right there in Virginia, not very far from JB's trailer.
When detectives went to interview JB again, he went crazy, screaming at them and cursing them out, demanding they get off his property. He then filed a formal harassment complaint against them, saying that they had slandered his name and told his fiancée that she was living with a murderer, saying that she'd become so upset that she had to get therapy and take time off of work.
An internal affairs investigation ultimately deemed JB's harassment allegations unfounded. But in the long run, It derailed the investigation, and the inquiry into John Brenan Crutchley for the murder of Debbie Fritz John officially ceased.
On October 15th, 1978, 10 months after her disappearance, the skeletal remains of Debbie Fritz John were discovered deep in the woods in Fairfax County by a group of hunters.
The body was so decomposed, basically just a skeleton, that it had to be sent to the Smithsonian for forensic experts to determine the identity. And it would take another 2 months for dental records to finally positively identify the remains.
Forensic scientists at the Smithsonian noted that the jaw showed signs of pink teeth, suggesting the cause of death to be asphyxiation by strangulation.
Fairfax County prosecutors sifted through all the evidence police had gathered and then, without explanation, deemed it insufficient to seek criminal indictment from a grand jury for John Crutchley.
The case then went cold and has never been solved to this day.
Chapter 4: Swinger Nerds with Syringes.
In 1979, JB got a job at TRW's Defense and Space Systems Group in Virginia. Here, he flourished, designing a new computer language for the United States Navy. He was so revered, he received a secret security clearance from the federal government in December of 1979, followed by a top-secret security clearance, which gave him open access to the Pentagon and other restricted military buildings.
His work often brought him into the Pentagon, and he later boasted of peddling drugs inside the Pentagon building, selling quaaludes and grams of coke, not for money, but just for the thrill of it, to do something illegal in the heart of the nation's military command.
During this time, a female coworker that JB obsessed over was found dead in her car in the Pentagon's vast parking lot. She was strangled to death, and no one has ever been charged with her murder.
Living in Virginia in the D.C. area, JB's life revolved around sex and drugs, but it was the 70s after all. He frequented sex clubs, and besides his usual penchant for group sex, partner swapping, and bisexuality, he began to heavily experiment with bondage and sadomasochistic acts.
And it was during this time that he met a nurse who introduced him to vampirism, tutoring him in the art of drawing and drinking blood, and instructing him in the rites of ritualist blood sex.
The kinky nurse taught him how to use intravenous needles, syringes, and surgical tubes, and showed him exactly how much blood could be taken from a person before reaching a life-threatening level. An amount I was surprised was so large.
She also told him that drinking human blood would purge one of their sins.
But JB, being a textbook narcissistic sociopath, I doubt he felt any guilt for his sins or anything at all.
JB developed an insatiable thirst for blood, and when he couldn't get it, he'd draw off a pint or two of his own to consume.
Pint or two of blood. That's a fuck ton of blood, man. It's crazy.
Yeah. To JB, blood represented power. Feeding on the essential life fluid of another fed his desire for dominance and control.
And like so many sociopaths, he learned how to compartmentalize his various selves, how to appear as a successful, professional, and straight-laced computer engineer, and conceal his true, sadistic, and literally bloodthirsty self. He learned to appear sweet and caring, how to lay on charm, while secretly seeing people as nothing but objects to exploit for money, power, personal gain, and use for sexual gratification.
He sought out masochistic women with low self-esteem who wanted to be beaten and dominated, like Judy Carter, a deeply troubled and suicidal married woman, tying her up and beating her with a whip until the whip broke, then photographing her and later reveling over the bruises on her body.
During all this wild sexual play, one of his sexual partners introduced him to a married woman named Karen White Lully, a masochist with an urge to be completely sexually dominated. She was somehow magnetically drawn to him, and sensing this was someone that would do whatever he asked, go along with any fantasy that should pop into his head, JB asked her to divorce her husband and marry him, which she did.
Karen, who physically appeared a very wholesome and straight-laced woman, said to resemble actress Meryl Streep, appealed to JB as he could use her not only sexually, but also as a way to maintain appearances, a pawn in his game of showing a mask of sanity and appear a happily married man to the outside world.
JB completed his graduate work, earning a master's degree in engineering in May of 1981, and 7 months later, Karen gave birth to a son, the couple named Jason.
Chapter 4. The Happy Vampire Family. In 1983, JB took a job in Palm Bay, Florida, as an engineer with the Harris Corporation, which built satellites and communication systems for the government. JB bought a sprawling property for his new family, with a large 4-bedroom home, a barn, and pond, down a dirt lane in Malabar, Florida, just east of Palm Bay.
There were stalls for horses and fenced-in pastures, and the Crutchleys settled into the nice neighborhood, appearing for all to see the portrait of respectability in American family life.
At work, JB developed a reputation as a harmless and goofy computer geek. A bit eccentric, he'd never wear socks, even when dressed in a suit and tie. But he was always smiling, and when folks asked him how he was doing, he'd say,
Ichi!
He was a bit of a goofy oddball, once participating in an underwater marathon game of Uno, where participants in scuba gear sat in the swimming pool of the Palm Bay Ramada Inn playing Uno, hoping to have the event featured in the Guinness Book of World Records. That is fucking bizarre. Bizarre way to spend your time.
Right? And he learned the art of manipulation and creating a false persona. A performance evaluation at work described him as, quote, very enthusiastic in performing his work and in his interface with others in the workplace.
He also learned to never show his fellow employees the darker side of himself. Though he went to office parties regularly and hosted large gatherings at his home, sometimes with upwards of 100 guests, coworkers say they never got to know him very well, and he kept his private life very guarded.
That is, until November 21st, 1985, the day a neighbor noticed a naked, handcuffed, and ankle-shackled teenage girl crawling down the road, nearly completely drained of blood and crying out for help.
Chapter 5. Christina.
Is there a place with sun all year round and pina coladas with pretty faces and sand on the ground? I want to stop this ongoing train before I lose my mind and go insane.
Christina Alma was a 19-year-old California girl from Sacramento who'd flown out to Florida to visit a friend and take a little vacation.
It was her last day in Florida, and while the friend she was visiting was at work, she she decided to walk into town to say goodbye to some friends she'd made. She hadn't gone far when a car pulled up, and a nerdy-looking but quite respectable-appearing man in a suit and tie asked her if she needed a ride.
Oh, maybe all we need is difference. It's hard at this speed to see anything.
Since it was beginning to rain and the guy appeared completely harmless, she took him up on his offer. As they motored along, he explained he had to stop by his house quickly to grab a notebook he'd left. But it was along the way, he assured her, and would only take a second. She thought nothing of it.
At the house, the man made a ruse of searching the backseat of the vehicle, then quickly looped a length of rope around Christina's neck and choked her into unconsciousness.
When Christina awoke, she found herself on a kitchen counter with her hands tied tightly over her head and her ankles bound, legs spread, stretched out spread eagle. The only source of light was a bare light bulb hanging down over her. And further adding to the horror movie atmosphere, the foul scent of brimstone billowed from a bronze bowl of sulfuric incense.
In the murky shadows was the blinking red light of a video camera mounted on a tripod.
The man appeared before her, thin, pale, and naked, and began to undress her, licking her body as he removed her clothes, and occasionally jerking on a rope secured around her neck.
Once she was fully unclothed, the man sexually assaulted her, a painful ordeal both physically and mentally for the poor teenager, because she was a virgin and had been saving herself for someone special.
The man then placed strips of tape over her eyes. As she struggled to see, she felt a cold pressure on the inside of her right arm, followed by a painful prick. Then she heard a strange noise, a suckling sound, and she felt herself growing weak. She asked the man, "What are you doing?" The man replied,
"I'm drinking your blood. I'm a vampire."
The man slurped her blood, inserting intravenous needles attached to surgical tubes into her right wrist and along the insides of her left arm, draining her until she passed out.
When she awoke, he untied her, put her ankles in shackles and her hands in cuffs, and walked her down a hall. She was so weak she collapsed several times. He forced her to eat a mysterious pill, then dragged her to a king-sized waterbed.
He lapped at the blood between her legs and raped her again, telling her,
"I'm not supposed to do this. I'm getting attached to you,"
before wrapping his hands around her throat and choking her, telling her he liked necks.
He then took her to the bathroom, bathed her in cold water and rubbed lotion over her, before taking her back to the bedroom where she passed out on the waterbed, only to be revived with smelling salts and raped for a third time, being asked repeatedly if she liked it.
Then he told her he was hungry, and she watched in horror as he inserted a needle into a vein on the inside of her arm, attached surgical tubing to it, and drained her blood into a glass jar, pausing at times to suck on the tube as if it were a straw, in order to get the blood flowing faster. When the jar was halfway filled, he put it to his lips and gulped it down. He then explained to her how he had to drink the blood quickly or else it coagulated.
After reshackling her ankles, he took her back to the bathroom, wrapped masking tape over her eyes, and laid her in the bathtub, instructing her to remain quiet.
Groggy and near death, she managed to push herself up and get the tape off her eyes. Wearily looking about, she spied a small window and lurched towards it. It was shut and locked, but the latch was broken, and she was able to jiggle it open, and then using all the force she had left within herself, She pulled herself up and squirmed out into the daylight, escaping the house of horrors.
Christina, legs and hands shackled, drugged and drained of blood, crawled and wormed her way to the road, where, after initially being passed by two separate vehicles who just stared at her, God, what the fuck, she was eventually rescued.
Doctors estimated she had lost approximately 45% of her blood.
Just to put into context how close this poor girl was to death, it's at 50% blood loss that your body will completely lose its ability to pump blood and maintain oxygen delivery.
Interestingly enough, Christina told authorities she just wanted to get out of Florida and go back to California where people were sane. I guess she hadn't heard about what was going on in Sacramento with Richard Chase just a few years earlier.
You'd think you were born the son of a dynastic king. You were raised on truffles and Tudors and other fine things. For all the glory you're cloaked in, the story's a lie. I see the empty, sad feeling you can't feel inside. And I'm sorry that the lives led by the common class fail to live up to your standards. We know you're such a big spender after all.
While a search warrant was being obtained, undercover officers began to stake out the house of the vampire.
And you promised, dear daddy, you'd use them to meet all his goals. But come Q3, he saw that you failed to meet quota.
While one officer patrolled the perimeter on foot, a car approached. And not wanting to be seen, the officer leapt into a ditch hidden by brush, only, to his absolute surprise, to find himself face to face with JB, armed with a pistol, who was watching as the police set up a perimeter around his house.
JB matter-of-factly told the officer that he was trespassing, and under Florida law, he had every right to shoot him if he wished. The surprised officer, his cover blown, left and scurried back to his unit.
Eventually, a warrant was procured, and authorities arrested Crutchley and searched his home.
Long before police had arrived, JB had realized Christina had escaped and had time to erase the videotapes and dispose of much of the evidence before hiding out there and waiting for police.
When questioned, he readily admitted Christina had been to the house and that he'd drained and drank her blood, but claimed it was all consensual. He said she was a member of the Manson family and had initiated the kinky sex, saying, quote,
"That Manson girl wanted it. She begged me to do it. I drank of the blood. I'll show you the beaker."
He then told detectives that he could have drained her completely of her blood if he'd chosen, and that he'd withdrawn blood from his wife in a similar fashion hundreds of times.
During the search, they found ropes, surgical tubing, intravenous needles and syringes, leather dog collars, chains, and baggies of hair clippings, as well as an ounce of marijuana. As the search commenced, JB began to cry, saying, "I screwed up. You got me now."
Investigators also found 20 women's necklaces hidden in his closet, as well as homemade pornography of JB tying up his wife on the countertop in the kitchen, just as he had done to Christina, attaching the ropes that bound her to hooks in the ceiling, pulling her up off the counter while fucking her and snorting lines of white powder.
Detectives also noticed his car, a beige 1982 Nissan Stanza, had been rigged so that he could pull a knob next to the radio and lock the passenger door via a wire that ran behind the dash, and that all identifying emblems, including the Stanza logos, had been removed or covered with black electrical tape.
There was a new computer at the residence, an expensive IBM PCXT with an Epson FX80 printer. But because it was not listed on the search warrant, it wasn't examined. This was still the early 80s, and law enforcement didn't realize that sex criminals often keep records of their crimes, as well as fantasies, on their computers.
JB was charged with sexual battery, aggravated battery, kidnapping, possession of marijuana over 20 grams, and possession of drug paraphernalia, with a notation that, quote, victim almost died from the severity of the crimes.
JB's wife was on vacation with their son at the time, and when he called his wife, they could hear him saying into the phone,
"Yeah, I picked up this chick, brought her home. Things got out of hand. Yeah, I got the camera out for her."
Later, when his lawyer asked JB if there was anything else in the house that might be incriminating, he cryptically said there was a hacksaw that may have human flesh on it. But his lawyer never told the police this interesting tidbit. Friends and neighbors were shocked to open the November 24th Sun-Sentinel newspaper and see the headline, "Rape victim tells police attacker drank her blood."
As you waltz through the forest, a voice it will sound. Follow the song.
One neighbor said, "I thought he was quite a decent and respectable fella, a warm person who always waved."
Another saying, "Most people in this area are nice folks. It's just beyond the scope of imagination."
JB's mother even chimed in, saying,
"I just can't believe it. The only problem we ever had was getting him to eat when he was a baby."
Five dimes in my pocket, 5 stops on the train, 5 times Sophia, we danced in the rain. Deep into the briar, a clearing away with aroma.
When the FBI heard of this case, their ears perked up, particularly Robert Ressler, whom we've discussed before many times. He said to get another search warrant and secure the damn computer, but when police returned to the home, the computer was long gone. JB had called his wife from jail and told her to get rid of it. He would later brag that detectives had really missed their opportunity there. And on December 2nd, JB was freed on a $50,000 bond, being deemed a low flight risk. He was unsurprisingly fired from his job, the Harris Corporation saying, quote, "Circumstances surrounding his legal situation rendered him ineffective."
Investigators went to JB's work and questioned his fellow employees, who told them that the password he'd used for the computer was always vampire.
Oh God, what a fucking douchebag.
Now dawns new morning, yellow and pink. No time for dancing, and none more to drink. And there you're still lying, unfurled like.
In JB's personal filing cabinet, they discovered a yellow box with over 70 photographs of bound and gagged women, posed in various graphic sexual positions, some with a man's hand wrapped around their neck, choking them.
They also found his index cards of women, that said things like,
Wants to do dirty pictures, cock teaser, very self-centered.
one for Debbie Fritzjohn stated,
Does not smoke cigarettes, likes antique jewelry, and then scrawled ominously at the bottom, disappeared 27th of January, 78.
They found reams of computer paper containing classified information about U.S. Navy operations, including submarine deployment data and satellite images of ships in the Middle East. It was given to federal agents who said it showed significant national security interests, though no federal espionage charges were ever brought against him.
Investigators also found the sandwich bag containing the identification card, social security card, and library card of a murdered woman named Patty Volansky, as well as 2 photographs of Patty's son.
Patty Volansky had vanished while walking to a convenience store in a wooded area between Dairy Road and Hollywood Boulevard. On December 15, 1985, 3 teenage boys hunting squirrels found her heavily decomposed remains in a forested area not far from JB's house.
And Patty was not the only local woman who'd gone missing recently, but the only body that had turned up.
On January 17, 1985, a Palm Bay real estate developer discovered skeletonized body parts just south of Malabar Road. Forensics determined it was the body of a white female approximately 30 years old. At one point, someone had attempted to saw through the left leg with a hacksaw. Missing vertebrae suggested the body had been decapitated. Unfortunately, the skull was never recovered, so dental records could not be checked.
Less than 2 weeks later, 2 more skeletonized bodies had been discovered less than 6 miles away by a pair of bird watchers. The area was along a trail less than a mile away from a Harris Corporation office building. These remains also showed saw marks.
Using a lower jawbone, a forensic odontologist was able to match one of the bodies to dental x-rays of a local missing person, 21-year-old Kimberly Walker, a young, free-spirit and sometimes sex worker from Vero Beach who had last been seen hitching on US 1, being picked up by a thin, well-dressed man in a plain-colored car.
Chillingly, when Kimberly's parents saw the photographs of JB in the newspaper, they said they recognized him from the funeral of their daughter. When they'd asked him who he was, he'd only said he'd been a friend of hers.
That made 4 women whose skeletonized remains were found in Brevard County, all within a 6-mile radius of each other, all in places John Crutchley was known to go.
Detectives then became aware of the Debbie Fritzjohn case in Virginia, and upon investigating began turning up many other missing women who'd come into contact with JB in Maryland, Virginia, Florida, and Pennsylvania, including 2 women at the Naval Air Station in Norfolk, Virginia.
Pamela Kimbrough, 23, disappeared on March 25, 1982. Her body was found the next day, tied up in the back seat of her car. She'd been raped and strangled.
On May 2nd, 1983, 21-year-old Carol Molnar was found wedged under the rocks of a seawall at the Naval Air Station.
Both had links with the vampire rapist.
A new arrest warrant was then made, and Crutchley's bail was revoked and raised to $500,000.
Accompanied by his attorney, JB turned himself in to deputy sheriffs at the precinct in Malabar and was transported to the jail in Titusville.
In the shadows of history lies tales of unimaginable darkness. From the hidden atrocities to the sinister secrets buried by time. Join me, Rob Bradley, as we delve into the depths of humanity's dark past, uncovering the chilling stories that history hoped you'd forgotten. Prepare yourselves for the macabre and the mysterious as we journey through tales of tyranny, betrayal, and bloodshed. Discover the forgotten massacres, the twisted minds of infamous villains, and the haunting echoes of crimes that shook the world. This isn't just history. This is dark history. Join me in the exploration of the darkest chapters of our past. Listen now on your preferred podcast provider, if you dare.
FBI agent Robert Ressler suggested that when investigators interview JB, they create what he called a bones room, a room of dim light filled with boxes bearing JB's name and the names of his victims.
It was believed this bones room would unnerve JB and cause him to confess, but unfortunately it had the opposite effect. When JB came in, he simply said,
"This room is evil. Take me back to jail."
And he refused to talk.
Chapter 6: The Vampire Rapist.
While in jail, JB bragged about being the vampire rapist, showing off newspaper articles about himself, calling himself Count Malabar, and during Halloween even managed to procure a set of plastic fangs, wearing them as he hissed at passing guards.
Fuck, man. What a fucking douchebag. He told fellow inmates how the police had failed to find all his secret hiding spots that contained videotapes of his crimes and a diary listing all of his victims, as well as a decapitated head of one victim he'd hidden in the concrete foundation beneath his barn.
He also said he'd come very close to killing his wife, Karen, but had always stopped because he thought he'd need her. And indeed, Karen stayed faithful, proclaiming his innocence and helping his legal defense.
Very disturbingly, JB said he'd often considered killing his 4-year-old son because he didn't like the way he looked at him, as if he could see the monster he was trying to hide. One night, JB said he'd stared at the child sleeping in his crib and thought of stuffing his mouth with candy and suffocating him, making it look like he choked on the candy.
Prosecutors then added 2 counts of robbery, charging JB with stealing Christina's blood. JB's lawyer telling reporters,
"It's bizarre. I'm sure there's never been a case before in Florida, probably not the whole country, that says if you take someone's blood, it's robbery."
Headlines ran worldwide saying, "Vampire arrested on blood theft charge."
And of course, like all prisoners facing trial and public scrutiny, JB found Jesus and was saved. Hallelujah. Yay. Now when he dies, he can go to heaven. I'm sure all his victims will just love it when he shows up there.
On April 23, 1986, JB took a deal and pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and 3 counts of sexual battery. In exchange, prosecutors dropped 2 counts of sexual battery, 2 counts of aggravated battery, 2 counts of robbery, including the robbery of blood, as well as the marijuana possession. Though his guilty plea lowered his charges, it would still be up to a judge to determine his punishment in a separate hearing.
The plea was categorized as being just the tip of the iceberg as police and prosecutors in Florida, Virginia, Ohio, and Maryland continued to investigate numerous unsolved homicides.
On June 16, 1986, the sentencing hearing proceeded. FBI agent and serial killer expert Robert Ressler was one of the main witnesses describing in detail the traits of a psychopathic sex killer.
JB spoke in his own defense, blaming the victim, saying it was all Christina's idea and saying, quote, "I feel that she was lost in her own world. She told me that she was one of Charles Manson's followers. I would like to sit down with her, but I understand that she is afraid of seeing me."
JB then said he'd grown up unloved and been lost and lonely his whole life, but had found Jesus and turned his life around now, saying the old him had been destroyed and replaced by a spiritually reborn John Crutchley, saved by the grace of his newfound Christian faith.
He denied ever drinking his wife's blood, and when asked why he had told the police he had done it hundreds of times, he just said, "Well, my life was over and I just wanted some attention."
His faithful wife, Karen, sat behind him the entire time, smiling at him and exchanging warm glances, telling the press that a man with such a brilliant mind should not be shut away, that he was no rapist or serial killer, just a kinky sort of guy.
On June 23rd, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison, the maximum amount, and then sentenced to a further 50 years of probation upon his release. The judge citing the bizarre and outrageous behavior that demonstrated an utter disregard for life.
Mildred, JB's mother, said her son should have been placed in a mental hospital, saying all the vampire stuff was from hallucinations caused by marijuana.
Yup, she blamed the weed and then called Christina Alma a tramp. Ugh. And then Karen said, get this,
"I don't know why the sentence exceeded the guidelines. It was a gentle rape, devoid of any overt brutality." Oh my God, I want to punch that woman in the teeth for saying that.
Right. He choked her unconscious, tied her up, dangled her from hooks, took her virginity, and drained her of 45% of her blood. It's fucking fucked up.
Delia, she liked to start fires, liked to watch the old buildings burn, had a deep-set belief that everyone gets what they've earned.
Chapter 7. Florida Department of Corrections, inmate number 103067.
Breathed in the sparkling new dawn, the cinders that caught in the breeze, like fireflies sparked and were gone.
During his time in prison, when not being repeatedly raped by other prisoners or hiding out in solitary confinement, JB relished his moniker as a vampire and bragged to his cellmate of murdering over 30 women, describing decapitation and mutilation in horrific detail.
And Delia, she believed that everyone could have enough, and it was the fault of so few.
Meanwhile, investigators continued to pore over clues, again searching his house and property, using cadaver dogs, performing soil core sampling to conduct chloroform testing, and combing the surrounding forests.
At one point, cadaver dogs indicated a spot on the far corner of the property, but it ended up just being a long dead dog that someone had buried.
Inside the barn, they found a hole cut into the concrete foundation about a foot deep, the perfect size for a human skull. But there was not a sign of blood or even a single human hair.
They used fiber optic technology to look inside the interior walls and the attic. They even drained the septic tank, but found nothing. In Virginia, a grand jury was scheduled to convene on September 15th to consider all of the evidence against JB for the murder of Debbie Fritzjohn. But just 2 days before the set date, the chief prosecutor canceled it, announcing that the evidence just wasn't enough to move forward.
Victims' families wrote to JB, including relatives of missing persons, pleading with him for any information. He wrote them back, seeming to take joy in communicating with them, but denied everything.
Karen, meanwhile, moved to Baltimore and started law school. Investigators went and interviewed her, and she continued to say that her marriage with JB had been a happy one, and that he was just a kinky kind of guy.
They interviewed JB in prison, bluffing and saying they'd discovered all kinds of evidence linking him to various murders, especially that of Debbie Fitzjohn. He just stared at them angrily and refused to talk.
John Crutchley was now a suspect in 32 murders in Florida, Maryland, Ohio, Virginia, and Washington, D.C., including Nancy K. Brown, 25, last seen walking in Cocoa Beach on June 9th, 1983, Diana Lee Casey, 20, who disappeared while walking to a convenience store near Canaveral on May 14th, 1984, Cheryl Ann Winsberg, who disappeared while hitchhiking in April 1984, and Tammy Lynn Lepart, 18, who disappeared while walking Cocoa Beach near an Exxon gas station. But investigators could find no hard evidence tying him to these murders.
The years slipped by, and with his release looming, in June of 1995, investigators returned to JB's former estate, this time using ground-penetrating radar. They tore down the barn to search beneath it. They ripped up the concrete pads that formed the foundation of the sheds. Again, nothing.
And JB's sentencing time grew shorter and shorter. He was given a 3,000-day reduction in July 1986 the minute he walked through the prison gates, and 50 days reduced for good behavior every 5 months afterward. Then 20 days a month beginning in 1987, totaling 1,960 days, and then another 176 days deducted for time served, bringing a total of 5,250 days reduced from his time, or 14 years taken off of his 25-year sentence, amounting to 40% of his original sentence. Some pointing out the reduced time roughly equated to the percentage of blood that had been drained from Christina Alma.
So after serving just 11 years of his sentence, Crutchley was set to be released on August 8, 1996, and start his 50 years of probation as a free man.
People were outraged, and they couldn't even find a state or county that would agree to take him. He tried to have his probation transferred from Florida to West Virginia, where his mother still lived, but they denied it. West Virginia wanted nothing to do with him. Neither did Maryland.
They eventually settled on the Christ is the Answer mission in Melbourne, Florida, a halfway house for transients and drug addicts. But the sheriff of Brevard County said, "Nuh-uh, no way. I'm not sure we can guarantee his safety if he comes here."
The Resurrection Ranch mission was contacted, but they rejected him as well. And the media picked up on the issue. Headlines saying, "No one wants the vampire rapist."
JB tried to address the public's concern, saying,
"I'm old, I'm beat, I'm tired, I've been beaten down. It's healing time. We've played the vampire game long enough."
Finally, a day before his release date, they found a place that would take him, the Orlando Probation and Restitution Center, a halfway house of sorts, where he'd stay until he could get a job and find a permanent residence.
During his stay, he'd have mandatory sex offender counseling, have to check in with corrections officers, and be under supervision and constant surveillance.
There was universal outrage. Christina's mother saying, "She's scared to go outside. She's become a hermit and said she will never have children because she is afraid of what might happen to them." Patty Valansky's mother saying, "I dread to see him get out of prison. I don't want him to hurt anybody else."
Debbie Fitzjohn's father said, "They're just going to let him out on the public? What the hell do they think he's going to do there? You mark my word, it'll happen again. He'll do the same thing again. FBI agent Robert Ressler said, "The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. A person who forcibly abducts, rapes, and bloodlets people doesn't have a record of being a safe citizen." And Deputy Chief of the Orlando Police Department, Charlie Wright, said, "To put him in the vicinity of a school, hospital, and several neighborhoods is like putting a kid in a candy store."
But in the end, they needn't have worried. For in a crazy twist, he was in the halfway house only one day when he was arrested again for violating his parole after testing positive for marijuana.
Yes, he failed his piss test. The inmates had thrown him a going-away party his last night in the prison, and the vampire rapist had smoked some weed. So, after just 30 hours as a free man, he was put in handcuffs and shipped back to prison for breaking his 50-year probation.
Folks actually celebrated.
But Blaise Tredis, executive assistant public defender, pointed out that it wasn't actually valid or legal, that you can only violate probation once you begin your probation. Taking drugs in prison violates prison rules, but not probation, which hadn't started.
And others couldn't help but note the irony that some drug offenders are giving longer sentences than he received for kidnapping, rape, and torture. And this literal vampire was only put back in prison because he smoked some weed. It was as if the state of Florida considered smoking weed worse than rape and torture.
Being reprocessed into the prison during intake, officers discovered that JB had a fuck ton of body piercings, including 12 rings through his penis and scrotum, and one in his navel. Isn't that cute? The vampire rapist has a belly button ring. And there was a large teardrop-shaped ring through the tip of his penis that actually had a small padlock on it. JB said that was meant to show his wife that he'd always be loyal in prison.
Jesus, gross Christ. The jail's operations commander remarked that it was the most bizarre thing he'd ever seen, and that Crutchley seemed very happy to show it off.
But then they told Crutchley he had to remove his piercings. And JB said, "Well, I can't do it. They're permanently affixed there." But when a guard said, "Oh, I'll get them out. Yo, grab me some pliers," JB was suddenly able to quickly remove them on his own.
On Tuesday, August 13th, 1996, JB appeared in court, a gray-haired, ghostly thing, stooped and wearing a red jumpsuit, meaning he was one of the most dangerous of prisoners. Many prison officials actually testified on his behalf, a Union Correctional Classification Officer, Robert Back, saying that he had an exemplary record. He'd never failed a drug test in prison and was a good worker.
JB himself testified, expressing remorse, saying he just spiraled out of control, describing his life as a cross between Forrest Gump and a Stephen King movie, saying, "I will never hurt anyone again in my life. I'm worn out, drained, but my 86-year-old mother needs me. My teenage child needs me. I need to be there for them to make up for some of the pain that I've caused in their lives."
After days of testimony, the judge gave Crutchley a life sentence on January 31st, 1997.
Bye-bye.
Afterwards, Florida law was changed to guarantee that prisoners serve 85% of their sentence before release.
And on March 30th, 2002, the vampire rapist was found dead in his cell, his eyes rolled up into his head, an albuterol inhaler beside him, a county hearth bread bag over his head, affixed with a rubber band around his throat, and his apparently rather large penis in his hand, the victim of an accidental death during the act of autoerotic asphyxiation. He was 55 years old and died accidentally masturbating.
Good riddance.
Yeah.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of John Brenan Crutchley, the vampire rapist. We hope you enjoyed it.
Crazy one, got any thoughts about that?
Just ick. Lots of ick.
It's gross.
Also, like, I don't know, just something about his picture just weirds me out. He's like very he's not as, like we've covered some people that are like gross and smell and have terrible skin. You just look at them and you're like, that looks like a literal monster that if I saw them on it, like this guy's like weirdly nondescript, but yet emanates a real strong creep factor all the same. I don't know. Just, yeah.
He's got that classic nerd look.
Yeah. And it was also like weirdly very unsurprising to me how he died.
Oh.
But yeah, we want to hear what you think. Let me know if you agree with me. We'll put his picture up.
Yeah, let us know, folks. And you got a case you think we should cover, or you want to say hi? Did we get something wrong? Let us know. Drop us a line at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. We will see you next week. Happy spooky season.